The night sky over Tehran did not simply darken, it fractured. The first explosions arrived as a distant tremor, a sound too heavy to be mistaken for thunder, and within minutes the world was watching a conflict that had been building through speeches, sanctions, protests, and warnings suddenly transform into open war. In Washington, the language was decisive, almost cinematic. A massive and ongoing military operation, a mission framed as protection, as necessity, as history unfolding in real time. In Iran, the reality was sirens, fire, confusion, and the return of a fear that has shaped generations. When Donald Trump appeared in the early hours to announce the beginning of what he called Operation Epic Fury, his message carried the tone that has long defined his political persona: absolute certainty, the language of strength, the promise that this was not only strategic but moral. He spoke of imminent threats, of nuclear danger, of decades of hostility that he argued had made confrontation unavoidable. The framing was clear: this was not presented as a new war, but as the inevitable climax of an old one. Yet while the speech was delivered in the controlled environment of a camera and a teleprompter, the consequences were immediate and chaotic across the region. Iran's retaliation came quickly, missiles streaking toward U.S. positions in the Gulf, intercepted in the skies above countries that now found themselves pulled into a conflict they did not choose but could not escape. Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, names that usually appear in economic headlines, were suddenly part of the military map, their airspace transformed into a corridor of defense systems and falling debris. For months the tension had been rising in layers. The protests in Tehran that began over economic collapse had evolved into something more political, more dangerous, more symbolic. The falling value of the rial was not just a financial crisis, it became a visual representation of a system under strain. Crowds in the streets were not only demanding change, they were being watched by a world that has learned to interpret unrest as a possible prelude to intervention. Trump's messages to those protesters had been unusually direct for a sitting U.S. president. He did not speak in the cautious language of diplomacy. He spoke as if he were already part of their movement, urging them to take over their institutions, promising that help was coming. When the bombs began to fall, that earlier rhetoric transformed into something far more consequential, an explicit call for a population under bombardment to rise against its own government. That moment will be debated for years, not just for its military significance, but for its political and ethical weight. Because embedded within the announcement of the operation was a second message, one aimed not at American voters or allied governments but at the people of Iran themselves. He told them their freedom was at hand. He told them to stay inside while the strikes continued. He told them this might be their only chance for generations. It was the language of revolution delivered from the outside. Supporters will see it as a declaration of solidarity with a population that has repeatedly shown signs of dissent. Critics will see it as an extraordinary escalation, a merging of regime change rhetoric with active military force. Either way, it represents a shift from containment to direct transformation, a move that reshapes not only the conflict but the global order around it. The strategic argument from Washington is built on familiar pillars: nuclear capability, regional security, the protection of American troops and allies. The Israeli military's confirmation that the operation was the result of long joint planning underscores how deeply coordinated the campaign is. This was not a spontaneous reaction. It was the execution of a scenario prepared over months, perhaps years. But war is never only strategy. It is also narrative, and the narrative being constructed in real time is as powerful as the missiles themselves. In the United States, the operation will be measured through the lens of national security, presidential leadership, and military capability. The language of strength, of rebuilding the armed forces, of unmatched power, speaks directly to a domestic audience that has long been divided over America's role in the world. For some, this is the projection of deterrence. For others, it is the opening of another endless conflict. In Iran, the narrative will be entirely different. Foreign bombs falling on the capital do not weaken nationalism, historically, they intensify it. A government facing internal dissent can suddenly reposition itself as the defender of the nation against an external enemy. The same protests that signaled vulnerability may now be reframed as secondary to survival. This is the paradox at the heart of intervention. The act meant to accelerate political change can just as easily delay it. Across the Middle East, the shockwaves are not only military but psychological. Every country hosting a U.S. base is now calculating its own exposure. Every alliance is being tested. Every rival power is watching to see how far this escalation will go and what it reveals about American doctrine in this era. Because this operation is not happening in isolation. It comes after previous strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, after months of threats, after evacuations that signaled something larger was coming. The pattern suggests a doctrine built on unpredictability, a willingness to move from pressure to force with little warning. That unpredictability is itself a strategy. It keeps adversaries off balance. But it also keeps allies uncertain and markets volatile and populations anxious. It turns geopolitics into a permanent state of anticipation. And then there are the human stakes, briefly acknowledged in the president's warning that American casualties are possible. That sentence, short, almost routine, contains the reality that will define the coming weeks. Behind every missile defense system are people. Behind every strike are soldiers who do not control the policy but live with its consequences. Behind every explosion in a city are civilians who were not part of any decision-making process. War is always announced in the language of objectives. It is lived in the language of loss. The future of this operation is now the central question. Is this a limited campaign designed to destroy military infrastructure and force negotiations? Is it the beginning of a broader attempt to collapse a regime? Is it a demonstration of force meant to redraw red lines across the region? The answer will determine not only the fate of Iran's leadership but the balance of power across the Middle East and the credibility of international law in an era where major powers increasingly act without consensus. For Trump, this is also a defining moment of his presidency. He framed it as an act no previous president was willing to take, a fulfillment of promises to confront Iran directly. That framing turns the operation into more than a military action. It becomes a test of his political identity as a leader who does what others would not. For the world, it is the opening of a new chapter whose ending no one can yet see. Because once the first bombs fall, the timeline changes. Diplomacy becomes reactive instead of preventive. Every response creates the conditions for another response. The pace accelerates, and the space for de-escalation narrows. And somewhere in Tehran, in Washington, in the control rooms of air defense systems across the Gulf, people are staring at screens and skies and phones, trying to understand how a crisis that lived for so long in speeches and headlines has become the defining reality of their present. History rarely announces itself politely. It arrives in flashes of light, in urgent broadcasts, in words spoken at 2:30 in the morning that echo across continents. And in those moments, the world shifts, not only because of what has been done, but because of everything that will now have to follow.